Heraclon Publishing presents Emancipated Women by Bolesław Prus. Translated by Stephanie Kraft. Read for you by Sachi Lovatt. Book 1. First published as a serial in the Daily Courier, Kurier Codzienny, 1890 to 1893. Published as a book in 1894. For Wiesław and Maria Olszak, quiet fighters for freedom, who introduced me to the richness of Bolesław Prus. Grateful acknowledgement is made to my English text editor, Laura Holland, the Polish Center of Discovery and Learning at Elms College, the Society of Polish and American Culture, Chicopee, Massachusetts, the 5-college seminar on literary translation based at Smith College, and the National Library, Warsaw. Copyright 2008 by Stephanie B. Kraft. For permission to reuse, contact Stephanie Kraft at dkraft@external.umass.edu. The cover design by Laura Holland incorporates a fragment of Zadumana, 1883, by Władysław Czachorski. Emancipated Women, Emancypantki, 1894, by Bolesław Prus. Book 1, Volume 1. Chapter 1. Feminine Energy and Masculine Indolence. Around the year 1870, the most famous academy for young ladies in Warsaw was Mrs. Ladder's boarding school. From it issued model citizens, happy wives, and excellent mothers. Whenever the newspapers announced the wedding of a wealthy, distinguished young woman who was making a good match, one could wager that among the maidenly attainments of Miss So-and-so, dressed thus and so, the beautiful bride, beaming with happiness, would be found a notice that she had attended Mrs. Ladder's school. After each such notice, several new pupils entered Mrs. Ladder's establishment, either as day students or as residents. It was no wonder that Mrs. Ladder, whose school brought such happiness to its alumni, was herself considered a happy person. It was said of her that, although she undertook her vocation with modest funds, she must possess tens of thousands of rubles, only it was not known if the capital was invested in mortgages or lay in the bank. No one had any doubts about her fortune when they saw the ball gowns worn by her daughter Helena, a lovely young lady of 19, or, above all, when they heard of the expenditures of her son Kazimierz, who was never sparing with money. But neither the maiden's gowns nor the bachelor's elegance occasioned unpleasant remarks, because their costs were kept within certain limits. Miss Helena went out to gatherings grandly, but rarely. Kazimierz went abroad to finish his education, and his stays in Warsaw were so brief that he could afford a little self-indulgence. Mrs. Ladder's acquaintances whispered that it was not unwise of her to take a lenient view of the whims of a young fellow who, in the society of the distinguished youth of Warsaw, had cured himself of democratic fancies. They even marveled at the wit and tact of the mother, who, instead of reprimanding him for imbibing those ruinous theories, allowed him to regenerate himself with the help of the elegant life. "When a young man becomes accustomed to social spheres in which one wears clean linen, he will stop growing long hair and a ragged beard," said her friends. The young man very rapidly grew accustomed to haircuts and clean linen, and even became such a thoroughgoing dandy that, in the middle of October, it began to be said that soon he was going abroad to study the social sciences. It was understood that it was not young Ladder, but young Norski, who was about to go abroad. Mrs. Ladder's name from her first marriage was Norska, and Helena and Kazimierz were children of that union. her second husband, Mr. Ladder, but never mind about him. Suffice it to say that from the time the boarding school was established, Mrs. Ladder wore widow's weeds, that whereas several times a year she went to Powązki and adorned the grave of her first spouse with flowers, no one asked whether the other spouse also lay at Powązki or somewhere else. It was no wonder that Mrs. Ladder, whose heart had been twice shattered by fate, was cool in her relations with others and maintained a stern exterior. In spite of her 40-some years, she was still a beautiful woman, taller than average, with a figure not showy but not thin. She had black hair slightly frosted with gray, expressive features, a dark complexion, and lovely eyes. Those who claimed to be experts in such matters declared that with such eyes Mrs. Ladder could make a conquest of any of a number of wealthy widowers whose daughters lived at her school or came as day students. Unfortunately, the possessor of the black diamonds had a look more penetrating than tender, which, together with her thin lips and impressive bearing, first and foremost aroused respect for her, in women as much as in men. Her pupils feared her, though she never raised her voice. The most high-spirited class fell silent at once if the children heard the door of the neighboring classroom opening in a particular way, and the even tread of the headmistress. The classroom teachers and even the professors marveled at Mrs. Ladder's magical influence over the students. Mothers of grown, eligible daughters thought uneasily of her Helena, as though the young beauty could deprive their girls of their matches, and ruin the futures of all maidens preparing for marriage. And more than one well-to-do father of a frail, homely son thought, "That rascal Norski has got enough health and good looks for 10 boys like my Kajtek, though Kajtek is well enough in his way." Mrs. Ladder, then, was happy in every respect, envied for her fortune, her authority, her boarding school, her children, even her eyes. In spite of that, an enigmatic crease outlined itself more and more deeply on her forehead, a shadow, falling from no one knew where, pushed farther and farther down her face, and her eyes gazed more and more piercingly beyond people, as if striving to catch sight of things that were invisible to others. On a certain afternoon, Mrs. Ladder was walking around her study, which looked out on the Vistula. October was drawing to its close, and the sun, hiding behind Warsaw, painted the houses of Praga, the chimneys of far-off factories and the gray, misty fields with a reddish-yellow light. The light was faded, as if it had been infected by faded leaves, or had absorbed the reddish-brown steam of the locomotive that, at that moment, was moving far and still farther out of Praga, disappearing with its cargo of people and, perhaps, of hopes. It was an appalling light, a reminder that October was in decline, an appalling locomotive, which gave rise to the thought that everything in the world is in ceaseless motion, and vanishes from us in order to appear to others somewhere else. Mrs. Ladder walked quietly around the carpet in her study, which looked like a man's office. From time to time she looked out the window, where the dimming light reminded her that the end of the month was near. Now and then she glanced at the oak desk, where several great ledgers lay, and a bust of Socrates leaned above them. But in the sage's furrowed brow she saw no portent favorable to herself. So she pressed her folded hands to her chest and walked faster, as if she were eager to get somewhere as quickly as possible. Her eyes flashed more brightly than usual, her lips were more tightly set, and on her face more and more deeply fell that shadow which neither the beauty of her children nor other people's high opinion of her could dispel. In the waiting room, the master clock, by which the other clocks were set, chimed 4:30. In her study, the big English clock, yet more ceremoniously, struck the half-hour, and in the more distant rooms a small clock, rapidly and faintly, echoed the sound. Mrs. Latter approached her desk and rang the bell. The dark curtain quivered, the door of the waiting-room opened quietly, and on the threshold stood a tall manservant with grey side whiskers, wearing a frock-coat. "What time did Stanisław give Mr. Zagierski the letter?" "Before 1, madam." "To him personally?" "Into his own hand," replied the servant. "You may go, and if someone arrives, show him in directly." "He makes me wait 2.5 hours. Obviously I cannot rely on him," she thought. "Of course he understands the situation perfectly. Until New Year's I need 7,600 rubles. From the day students I will have 2,500. From the boarders 1,500 at most will come to me. So that is 4,000. But where is the rest? And after New Year's? After New Year's it appears that the income will be 4,000 rubles less than in previous years. There's no point in deluding myself. 6 boarders and 20 day students have left and will not attend next year and will never attend. That leaves a net income of 1,000 rubles a year at most, which could suffice for one person, but not for the 3 of us. And what then? Paying the lesser debt will bring on greater debt, then still greater, so that finally it must be the end of everything. Zagierski has opened my eyes abruptly. He does not delude himself. To Mrs. Latter, life was so filled with numbers so preyed on her imagination, that whatever she looked at, she saw numbers. The ledgers lying on the desk were swollen with them. They jumped out of the great gilded inkwell. They crawled around the English etchings that adorned the walls of the study. And how many of them hid in the heavy folds of the curtains and behind the glass front of the ornately carved bookcase, and how many huddled together in the shadow of each of the portieres, no one could have counted. In order to divert her attention from those thin, vexing apparitions, Mrs. Latter raised her head and, standing in the middle of the study, began to listen to what was transpiring on the floor above her. On that floor was a salon in which students received visitors. But at that moment there were evidently no visitors, since the schoolgirls were passing continuously through the salon. There were 2 of the older ones going from their bedroom to class with even steps, no doubt hand in hand. There was a first or second form pupil running. There was one girl walking around the salon in a circle, perhaps studying. Someone else dropped a book. Then a heavy, wide footfall could be heard. It was Miss Howard, the most distinguished teacher in the school. "Oh, that Clara Howard," Mrs. Latter whispered. "That woman has brought me bad luck." At Miss Howard's entrance, the pupils immediately fled from the salon, and a few people came in. One, then another, then a third. Miss Howard's heavy steps became quick and nimble, and the moving of chairs could be heard. Obviously someone had come for a visit. "Perhaps Malinowska, that friend of Howard, is here to look over my school," thought Mrs. Latter. "Those lunatics see everything the same way. She has 12 or 15,000 rubles, so she will start a school in order to ruin me. Naturally, she will lose her money in 2 years, because she thinks her calling is to revolutionize the education of young women. Howard will write her program. Ha! Ha! The press will be happy, because for a while she will stop dropping articles on the editors' desks like a doctor laying on poultices. Independent women. I am not independent, I who created the school from nothing. They, only they, will teach me independence on 13,000 rubles that Malinovska wants to waste on Howard's nostrums. The hand of the English clock moved slowly toward 5 o'clock, reminding Mrs. Latter that her evening receiving hours were soon to begin. At the same time, it reminded her that thousands of people had made their way through this study, people with demands, requests, inquiries. All of them had received answers, help, explanations, and what had come of it? What remained from all that counsel given to others? Nothing. A steadily deepening deficit today, and possible bankruptcy tomorrow. But I will not give up, Mrs. Latter whispered, putting both hands to her head. I will not give up. I will not sacrifice my children. I will not sacrifice anything. It is not true that there are situations with no way out. If there are too many boarding schools in Warsaw, the weaker ones will collapse, not mine. Her keen hearing caught a murmur in the waiting room. Someone, instead of ringing, jogged the door handle once or twice, and when the footman opened the door, slowly removed his wraps and spoke in an undertone. Mrs. Latter pursed her lips wryly, guessing from these preparations that such a visitor must have come to further his own interests, not hers. In the door appeared the grey whiskers of the footman, who whispered, "That one professor." And a moment later, a person in a black coat, stocky, of medium height, walked into the study. He had a pale, bloated-looking face, a dull-eyed, benevolent look, and a bald pate with a tuft of hair that stretched from right to left above his forehead like a dark scar. Walking slowly, he raised his knees high and held the thumb of his left hand behind the lapel of his coat, all of which seemed to attest that this mild-mannered gentleman was not distinguished for his physical vigor. Mrs. Latter, standing with her hands folded on her chest, buried her burning gaze in his glassy eyes, but the visitor was too phlegmatic to even be abashed by her look. "I have just—" he began. At that moment the master clock, the English clock, and the little clock in one of the distant rooms struck 5 in their various ways. The visitor paused in his speech, as if not wishing to disturb the clocks, was silent, then began again. "I have reached a decision," said Mrs. Latter, interrupting him. "You will give not 6 but 12 lectures here each week." "Very good." 6 lectures on geography and 6 on natural science." "Very good." The visitor repeated, nodding a few times, but not taking his left thumb from under the lapel of his coat, a mannerism that had begun to irritate Mrs. Latter. She interrupted him again. "You will be paid 48 rubles a month." The visitor closed his mouth, but began to drum rapidly on his lapel with the fingers of his left hand. Then, training his mild eyes on Mrs. Latter's nervous face, he said, "Surely that is not 10 zlotys an hour." "Rubles," replied the headmistress. Someone rang the bell energetically and walked into the waiting room with a rustling sound. "I believe that my predecessor received 2 rubles an hour." "At present we are not in a position to pay more than 1 ruble an hour for these subjects. Furthermore, I have 3 candidates," said Mrs. Latter, looking at the door. "Very well," said the visitor, always speaking in an even tone. "Perhaps in exchange, however, my niece—" "We will speak of this tomorrow, if you please," she interrupted with a bow. The visitor, not betraying any astonishment, lingered for a moment, collected his scattered thoughts, and, with a nod, left the study. As he walked out, he raised his knees as high as before and never removed his thumb from his lapel. "A complete milksop," thought Mrs. Latter. The footman opened the door, and in from the waiting-room proceeded a lady, not tall, but stout and florid, wearing a silk dress of light golden brown. The flowing motion of her gown seemed to fill the whole room with its rustle, and the remaining daylight fled before the glare of her watch chains, her rings, her bracelets, and the brilliants glittering in her hair. Mrs. Latter greeted her and conducted her to a leather sofa, on which the lady sat in such a way that she seemed to grow even shorter, and the gown overflowed still more. When the servant lighted a pair of gas lamps, one could imagine that the lady's plump hands restrained, with difficulty, a deluge of silken fabric that might have engulfed the room. "I have seen my daughters settled upstairs," she began, "and I would like to ask that they be allowed to take leave of me tomorrow." "You depart tomorrow?" Yes, madam, in the evening," the woman sighed. 10 miles by train, then 3 by coach. My one comfort on the journey will be that my children remain in your care. What a distinguished person Miss Howard is, and what an excellent school!" As a sign of gratitude, Mrs. Latter inclined her head. "I have never seen such a fine staircase in any school," said the lady, who bowed in return with a grace befitting of the profusion of her hazel gown. "And lovely accommodations. Only I have a favor to ask, madam," she added with a pleasant smile. "My brother has given my girls some very fine bed curtains from his own factory. Would it be possible to have them hung over the beds? I can see to it myself." "I would have nothing against it," replied Mrs. Latter, "but the doctor does not allow it. He says that curtains in the bedrooms obstruct the flow of air." "Dr. Laransky is your attending physician?" the lady put in. "A doctor of great reputation. I know him, because he came to us 4 times from Warsaw 2 years ago, 10 miles by train, then 3 by carriage, when my husband was ill with his bladder. I know him extremely well. Each journey cost us 120 rubles. So perhaps he will make an exception for my children." "I doubt it very much," answered Mrs. Latter, "because last year he would not allow curtains to be hung over the bed of Count Kishil's niece, who was living in the dormitory with your daughters." "Ah, if so," sighed the lady, wiping her face with a lace handkerchief. There followed a pause, during which it seemed that each lady wanted to say something, and was searching for the proper way. The more the lady in the hazel gown gazed at Mrs. Latter, the more Mrs. Latter tried to assume an expression of polite indifference. The darting eyes of the guest said, "Well, you speak first, then I will be bolder," whereas Mrs. Latter's chiseled features seemed to answer, "No, you attack me, and I will prevail." In this struggle of impatience with cold blood, the lady in silk gave way. "I would like to ask another favor," she began, "to ask that my daughters become more accomplished." "Please continue." "My husband likes that instrument very much. He even has a zither, because when he was training in Vienna, he belonged to a society of zither players. The other could learn to paint with pastels, at least. How nice it is to see young women painting with pastels! When I was in Carlsbad last year, all the young English women, whenever they weren't having croquet parties, opened their sketchbooks and painted. It so enhances the graces of a young person." "Which of them wants to paint?" "Which? Neither of them wants to," the lady answered with a sigh. But I think the older should, because, after all, she must marry first." "Please, madam, how will these accomplishments benefit them?" Mrs. Latter inquired in a soft voice. "Poor things, they already work more than other students at their lessons." "But I would not have expected such an opinion from you," replied the lady, adjusting herself on the sofa. "How can it be that accomplishments are not necessary for a young woman in our times, when everyone says that a woman ought to be independent, ought to be educated in all fields?" "But they have no time." "Time?" repeated the guest with a touch of irony. "If they have time to sew linen for foundlings in shelters?" "In that way they learn to sew." "My daughters, thank God, will not need to sew," retorted the lady with a dignified air. "But never mind. If you do not wish to give me my suggestions, your consideration, the girls must wait." Mrs. Latter grew cold at these last words. So again, 2 boarding students praying 200 rubles were going to leave. "In that case," continued the lady, striving for a tone of icy sweetness, "perhaps madam will do me this favor at least, to have the girls dance." "They are studying with a ballet dancer of the first rank." "Yes, but they dance only with each other. They do not meet other young people. Meanwhile, today," said the lady with a sigh, "when the world demands that a woman be independent, when young Englishwomen go skating and ride horseback with young men, our poor girls are so timid in the company of gentlemen that not a word do they utter. My husband is in despair and says that they are altogether stupid." "Madam, I cannot invite boys to the dancing lessons," answered Mrs. Latter. "Ha! In that case," the lady said, lowering her voice, "you will not be surprised if after the holidays—" "I would not be surprised at anything," replied Mrs. Latter, whose anger was rising. "But in the matter of your account—" The lady folded her plump hands and said sweetly, "Just now I should like to pay the remainder for the first half year. How much do I owe you?" 250 rubles. The lady's voice became yet sweeter when she said, drawing her purse from her pocket, "Could we arrive at a round figure? 200? Indeed, some girls pay 400 rubles a year, here and at other schools. I tell you sincerely, I would not think of withdrawing my children from such a model school, where there is truly motherly supervision, order, beautiful manners, if madam would agree to 800 rubles a year, because madam would not believe what terrible times these are for us. Barley went up by 50%, and hops, madam! Add to that, we have 3 miles of the worst sort of road between us and the railroads, that my poor husband is continually ill with his bladder, and that next year I must go to Carlsbad again. I do swear that these days there are no people so unhappy as manufacturers, and all the world thinks we have everything but bird's milk," she concluded, wiping the tears from her eyes, this time with a cambric handkerchief. The lace handkerchief had another purpose. "Let it be 200 rubles for the time being," Mrs. Latter answered slowly. "Dear, dear lady!" cried the guest, as if she were ready to embrace her. Mrs. Latter bowed courteously, took 200-ruble notes, cut a receipt from her book, and handed it to the portly woman, over whose face joy and tenderness raced like 2 clouds over a clearing sky. As she led the rustling and glittering lady out to the waiting-room and paused until she made her exit, Mrs. Latter said to the servant, "Ask Miss Howard to come to me." She returned to her study and began to walk around fretfully. She saw before her the glassy eyes of the professor, who held his left thumb behind his lapel and agreed without protest to the reduction of his income by 24 rubles a month. And beside him, the hazel gown and sparkling jewels of the woman who had wrenched 50 rubles for the half-term from her. "Oh, it is hard," she said to herself. "The needy one must give in. So it was, is, and will be." There was a knock at the door. "Please come in." The door opened slightly, and in walked, or rather burst, a girl of 18, who stopped suddenly before the headmistress. She was of medium height, a brunette, with round eyes and a curving mouth. Black ringlets were scattered across her low forehead, as if she had been running against the wind. Her gray eyes, dark skin, and red parted lips glowed with health, energy, and cheerfulness, but this bounding vivacity was checked by Mrs. Ladder's presence. "Ah, Magda, how are you?" Mrs. Ladder asked. "I have come to tell you," the girl said quickly, with a schoolgirl curtsy, "that I was with Zofia Piasecka. The poor thing has a little fever, but nothing serious, and she is only afraid that she will not be able to attend classes tomorrow." "Did you kiss her?" "I don't remember. Anyway, I washed my face and hands." "Please, ma'am, it can't be anything too bad," she added with profound conviction. "She is such a dear, good child." Mrs. Ladder smiled. "What happened in the third form?" she inquired. "Oh, please, ma'am, nothing. The professor is the most worthy man, but he was offended for no good reason. He thought Zdanowska was laughing at him, but what had happened was that Szczęglowa had showed her the chimney sweep on the roof, so she started giggling." "Please, ma'am," she spoke in a pleading voice, as if it were a matter of pardoning someone sentenced to hard labor. "Don't be angry at Zdanowska. I pacified the professor," she continued in a playful tone. "I took him by the hand and looked him sweetly in the eye, and he thought none the worse of Zdanowska. And in the meantime the poor child was crying so, and falling into such despair, that she was even upset with me." "Even with you?" responded the headmistress. "Is Miss Howard upstairs?" "Yes, just now Helena and Kazimierz are visiting with her, and they are talking about very intellectual things." "About the independence of women, no doubt?" "No, but about how women should support themselves, and how they should not be overly sentimental, and how they should be in every way like men. Wise like them, courageous like them. But it seems to me that Miss Howard is coming right now." "Come to me after 6, Magda. I will give you some work," Mrs. Ladder said, laughing. The girl disappeared through the doorway leading to the waiting room, and in the meantime the middle door was opened by a forceful hand. In it stood a tall, strongly built woman in a black gown. She had a long, monotonously rosy face, fair hair, the color of the Vistula when it rises, and a figure as trim as it was upright. She looked somewhat haughtily at Mrs. Ladder, nodded, and said in a contralto voice, "You wanted to see me?" But behind her tone another meaning could be sensed. If someone wants to see me, it should be they who come to me. Mrs. Ladder helped the teacher to a seat on the sofa, then, sitting on a chair herself, pressed Miss Howard's long hands and said warmly, "I should like to talk with you, Clara, but above all, please do not think that I have any intention of affronting you." "I do not assume that anyone has any right to affront me," replied Miss Howard, withdrawing her hands, which at that instant were covered with cold perspiration, from the hands of the headmistress. "I so respect your abilities," said Mrs. Ladder, looking into the pale eyes of the teacher, on whose brow a frown was beginning to appear. I marvel at your knowledge, your industriousness, your conscientiousness." A cloud appeared on Miss Howard's pink face. "I respect your character. I am aware of the sacrifices you make for universal goals." Miss Howard's face grew cloudier. "I take pleasure in reading your excellent articles." At that instant something like a sunbeam flashed over Miss Howard's face and dispelled the thundercloud. "I do not agree with everything," Mrs. Latter went on, "but I devote a great deal of thought to them." A new cheerfulness was visible in Miss Howard's face and bearing. "The struggle with prejudice is difficult," the teacher answered, beaming. "So I consider it a most important victory if readers even reflect upon what I have written." "Then we understand each other, Clara." "Completely." "And now may I ask you to take one thing under advisement?" "Please." "Well then, Clara, for the sake of the cause to which you are dedicated, please be more cautious in conversation with the students, particularly the less advanced ones, and with their mothers." "Do you think that some danger threatens me?" Miss Howard exclaimed in a deep contralto. "I am resolved to take what comes." "To take what comes, yes, but surely not to take having your ideas distorted. A moment ago I had with me a person with whom you had been conversing upstairs about the independence of women." "Was it Korkovichova, the brewer's wife?" "A provincial goose," Miss Howard put in a scornful tone. "You see, you are in a position to make light of her, but I must take her seriously. And do you know how she turned that conversation about the independence of women to her own advantage? She demands that her daughters learn to paint with pastels and play the zither, and above all that they marry as quickly as possible." Miss Howard shifted restlessly on the sofa. "I did not put her up to this," she cried. "Why, in an article about the upbringing of our women, I expressly protest against forcing girls to the piano, to drawing, even to dancing, if they have neither the talent nor the inclination. And in an article on the vocation of women, I excoriate those doll-like creatures who dream that they can make a career of marriage. Finally, I did not talk with that lady about what women ought to be like, but about how they are brought up in England. There a woman is educated like a man. She learns Latin, gymnastics, horsemanship. There a woman can walk alone on the streets, take trips. There a woman is a free, honored being." "Do you know England?" Mrs. Latter asked suddenly. "I have read a great deal about it." "And I have been there," Mrs. Latter interposed, "and I assure you that the upbringing of English women seems quite different in our imaginations than it is in reality. Would you believe, for example, that there young women are beaten with switches now and then?" "But they ride horseback." "Those who have horses, or who can afford the use of them, ride, as they do here." "So it is possible to teach girls horsemanship and gymnastics," Miss Howard said resolutely. "It is possible, but it is not possible to open a riding academy at a boarding school." "But it is possible to establish a gymnasium. It is possible to teach bookkeeping and crafts," Miss Howard retorted impatiently. "And if parents do not want those things, but only want the girls to learn painting or dance with boys?" "The unenlightened ideas of parents cannot constitute a program for the rearing of their children. That is the business of institutions of learning, to reform society." "And if the revenues of the institutions of learning suffer because of the reform?" asked Mrs. Latter. "In that case, the directors of the institutions, inspired by a sense of social responsibility, must resolve to make sacrifices." Mrs. Latter stroked her head with her hand. "Do you think that every headmistress of a boarding school has the means to make sacrifices?" Those who do not have the means should surrender the field to those who have them," answered Miss Howard. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Ladder languidly, rubbing her head again. "My head aches, and I have had so much to do today. So, Miss Malinowska is determined to open a school?" "She would prefer to be a partner in some reputable establishment, and I have urged her to speak to you." A deep flush appeared on Mrs. Ladder's face. It flashed through her mind that such a partnership might be the saving of the school, or perhaps its final ruin. A partner would have to inform herself about the financial situation, would have the right to ask about every ruble Kazimir spent. "I will not be partners with Miss Malinowska," said Mrs. Ladder, lowering her eyes. "Pity," the teacher answered dryly. "But, Clara, you will be more cautious in conversation with the pupils and their mothers?" Miss Howard rose from the sofa. "I alone answer for my own lack of caution, and I would not think of denying my convictions." "Even if, as a result, I lost students whose mother wants to place them in a cheaper school, organized around these reforms?" Mrs. Ladder said slowly and emphatically. "Even if I myself lost my employment here," Miss Howard answered just as emphatically. "I belong to that class of persons who do not sacrifice ideas or social responsibilities for the sake of their own personal prospects." "And so what ultimately do you want?" "I want to make woman independent. I want to train her for the struggle with life. I want to free her at last from dependence on men whom I despise," said the teacher, her pale eyes flashing with a cold brilliance. "Nevertheless, if you think that I am not needed here, I can be gone after New Year's. You find my views irritating, if not injurious, and I am weary of coping with routine, of accounting for every word, of the struggle with myself." She bowed ceremoniously and went out, taking longer strides than usual. "Hysteric," Mrs. Ladder whispered to herself, pressing her hands to her head again. "She would have us set up courses in bookkeeping and crafts when parents want their daughters to paint with pastels and marry as soon as they can. And for that kind of experiment I am going to sacrifice my children?" From the outer rooms, through an open door, a conversation floated back to her. "Here, madam, I will make a bet with you," said a sonorous male voice, "that a month from today, at the latest, you yourself will demand that I kiss your hand. You are my witness, Helena. It's all in having the knack." "But how much are you betting?" put in a female voice. "I do not bet," retorted a second female voice, "not because I am afraid of losing, but because I don't want to win." "So the women of our era answer," the first voice remarked laughingly. "Oh, that is childishness," answered the man. "That's not a new era at all, but feminine fussiness, old as the world." Into the study walked a lovely pair, Mrs. Ladder's son and daughter, both blonde, both with black eyes and dark eyebrows, each like the other. But all the womanly graces were gathered in her, while he was the embodiment of strength and health. Mrs. Ladder looked at them with delight. "What is all this about bets?" she asked, kissing her daughter. "That is with Magda," answered Helena. "Kazik wants to kiss her hand, and she won't let him." "The usual preludium. Good evening, mother," her son greeted her. "I have asked you so many times, Kazik." "I know, mother, I know, but I am desperate." "A week before the 1st of the month?" "That is just the trouble. It is a week yet," sighed her son. "You really are out of money?" demanded Mrs. Ladder. "There are matters too serious for me to joke about." "Oh, Kazik, how much do you want?" said Mrs. Ladder, pulling open the drawer in which the money lay. "You know, mother, that I give priority to no one color, but I like white with rose and blue. It's for love of the French Republic." "Please don't joke. Will 5 rubles be enough?" "5 rubles, Mamma, for a week?" said her son, kissing her hand and tenderly stroking her face. "Indeed, you have stipulated then I am to receive 100 rubles a month, and so for a week—" "Oh, Kazik, whispered his mother, counting out the money. "Please, Kazik, try to hasten the emancipation of women. Perhaps when it arrives your poor sister will get a quarter of what you get," remarked Helena. Mrs. Latter glanced at her reproachfully. "Surely that is not what you think," she said. "Do I make any distinction between you? Do I love you less than I love him?" "My God, have I said anything like that?" answered the young woman, drawing her white shawl around her shoulders. "To be sure, Miss Howard is right, that we girls are unfairly treated by comparison with boys. Kazik, for example, not having finished at one university, goes abroad to another, and stays there for 4 years, and I, in order to get abroad, would have to get consumption. As it was in childhood, so it will be after marriage and until death." Mrs. Latter looked at her with burning eyes. "So Miss Howard is expounding these views and making a convert of you?" "You are hearing things, Mother," said Kazik, walking around the study with his hands in his pockets. "Miss Howard has not been inducing her to go abroad. Only she herself desires that. On the contrary, Miss Howard instills the view that women ought to work to support themselves as men do." "And if men do nothing, and yet 100 rubles a month is not enough for them?" "Helena!" her mother said rebukingly. "Do not take what she says seriously, Mother," said her son with a smile. "Indeed, half an hour ago she was arguing that as an oak must grow longer than a rose, so a man's education must take longer than a woman's." "I said what you continually repeat to me, but I think differently." "I beg your pardon. I do not compare women to roses, but to potatoes." "Oh, you see, Mamma, what refinements he acquires in his social circles." 6 o'clock. I must go to Ada. Anyway, be well, my oak," said Helena, taking her brother's head in her hands and kissing him on the forehead. "You have studied so long and you still have so much learning before you that certainly you are much wiser than I am. Perhaps that is why I do not always understand you. Goodbye, Mother," she added. "I will be here in an hour with Ada. Perhaps you will invite us to tea." She went out, laughing. Kazimierz walked around the study with his hands in his pockets and said, hanging his head, "After every such remark of Helena's I feel pangs of conscience. Perhaps it's true that I ought not to be educated, only to work to support myself. Perhaps I am a burden to you." "What has come into your head, Kazik? Indeed, I live only for your hopes, your future." "And I give you my word of honor, Mother, that I would rather go without a piece of dry bread than be a drag on you. I know very well that I spend a lot and will continue to spend, but I do it in order to form connections. Yet how many times shame has overcome me because I find myself among wasteful, jaded people with no affinity for great ideas. But I must persist. I will be happy only when, as a representative of the working classes, I can throw it in their faces." There was a knock on the door, and after a moment a pretty girl with chestnut hair and large, dancing eyes entered the room. She blushed like the sky at sunrise and said quietly, "Excuse me, madam. My relations weary me again with requests that I visit them." Her blush deepened. "Indeed, Joanna, you are on duty today," answered Mrs. Latter. "I know, madam, and I am sorry about that, but Miss Howard has promised to stand in for me." Kazimierz looked out the window. "Will those relations of yours be here very long?" Mrs. Latter asked a little coldly. "For a few days, but I will make up all my work. I will not budge from here all winter." "So be it. Oh, go if you like, my child." When Kazimierz turned around, the chestnut-haired girl was gone. "This continual gadding about does not please me," Mrs. Latter said, as if to herself. "Well, relatives, perhaps, from the country," remarked her son. "Miss Howard has an adverse effect upon the entire school," Mrs. Latter said, sighing. "She has to interfere in everything. She has even turned your heads." "Mine?" Kazimierz burst out laughing. "Old and ugly, but wise for all that. Oh, these scribblers in petticoats, these reformers." "Nevertheless, you want to be a reformer." Kazimierz caught his mother in an embrace, and, covering her with kisses, said in a subdued, caressing tone, "Ah, Mamma, you misconstrue me. If you see in me a reformer of Miss Howard's sort, then I would rather go and work for the railroad. After 10 years I will qualify for a salary of several thousand rubles. Then I will marry. I will grow stout. But perhaps I really am a burden to you?" "Just stop saying that, please." "All right, I will never say it again. And now I kiss Mamma good night on one eye, and now on the other. I will not be here this evening for tea with you, Mother. I must go. How peaceful it has been here with you all, and there—" "Where are you going?" "I'll drop in at the theater, and later I'll pop round for supper. Oh, how it all wearies me sometimes." Again he kissed her eyes, face, and hands. On his way out he blew her a kiss from the threshold and disappeared into the waiting-room. "Poor girls," thought Mrs. Latter, "how they must go mad over him." From the door her glance fell involuntarily on the desk drawer from which she had taken 25 rubles to give her son not long before. She quivered. "What, will I begrudge him what I give him?" she thought. "Is he going to become a railroad worker? Never, as long as I live." Chapter 2. Hearts and Rubles. The hour for receiving visitors had ended. As had been her habit of many years, Mrs. Latter sat at her desk with its masculine, businesslike appearance. From it, the musing Socrates looked back at her, and the large inkstand, and the still larger ledger. At such a moment in the old days she would have set about doing the accounts, and reading and answering letters. But for a year now, more or less, the old habits had been undergoing a change. She did not review the accounts, for what would she see in them? The signs of impending deficit? She did not read letters, because today there were none at all. Nor did she have the will to write letters, because she knew the result in advance. Some would send the money, others would beg for an extension. So what would be the good of writing? She felt that for some time she had had less power than formerly over the course of events, but events had had great power over her. At this very moment, instead of working at the accounts, planning for the future, devising strategies, she sat with her hands lying slack on the arms of her chair and gazed at the frightening visions her imagination was spinning out before her. Again she saw the plump matron who wanted her daughters to be taught to paint and play the zither, but had snatched back 50 rubles of the agreed-upon fee. Then she saw the flaxen-haired Miss Howard who, desiring to make women self-sufficient, was setting about to ruin her, a woman who had been self-sufficient for more than a dozen years. Last of all, she remembered the placid face of the geography teacher, who had accepted the loss of 24 rubles a month without protest. "Milksop," said Mrs. Latter angrily. "Not a man, just warm dumplings." The thought of dumplings reminded her that the baker's and butcher's bills would soon be due, and 2,000 rubles each half-year had to be paid for the school building and grounds. "Well, tonight I cannot think of this," she told herself, and shuddered. Helena is with Ada, and Kajik is surely dressing for the theater. But the day's conversation with the children did not evoke pleasant memories. How could it be that Kazik had not gone abroad by now? Leaving aside that he was her son, and a handsome fellow, even the most severe judge would have to admit that he was an exceptional young man of whom all Europe would be talking after a few years. What ambition! What maturity! How ashamed he would be of those who were his friends today, for they had no great ideas, and what ideas he must have! Merciful God, was it possible that such a boy could not go abroad only because his mother did not have thousands of rubles in cash? How could it be that society did not have institutions to disperse funds for higher education to young men of genius? She would go to such an institution directly, and, having stipulated for confidentiality, would say to its administrators, "Gentlemen, I have brought up generations of your sisters, wives, and daughters, but I myself do not have the money to complete my son's education. Therefore I ask for help, not for the sake of my work and merits, but because Kazik is a brave, brilliant, noble young man. Oh, if you knew him as I do, you would believe that even if he were not my son, but a stranger to me, I would still find his future worthy of my concern. Because, only look at him. Study his every word, glance, movement. But why go on? Only take him to your heart as I do, and you will be convinced that an exquisite soul dwells in this dear young man." But Mrs. Latter wrung her hands distractedly, for, after all, there was no institution that could assist young men of genius, and even if such a thing were created, would its directors believe that what she said about her son was gospel truth? The fruit of cool-eyed observation, not maternal ardor? Did she not know people? Did she not hear the whispers that went around about Kazik? Anyway, it was no wonder that strangers were whispering if his own sister, a girl moreover as exceptional as Helena, sometimes joked about Kazik's deep sayings, and even she felt aggrieved that her brother's education had cost so much. "Do you not understand?" ran Mrs. Latter's internal debate with Helena. "What a difference exists between man and woman. Why, you are as like each other as twins, but in spite of that, compare yourself with him. His voice, his height, his looks, his every move. If you are the flower of creation, he is its lord and master. And furthermore, think, what are women's strengths in comparison with men's? I, at whose shrewdness and energy they all marvel, could hardly bring up the two of you and support myself. Meanwhile, a man can support himself and a wife, rear several children, and still operate factories, govern nations, invent things." At that instant, the shadow of a man intruded itself on Mrs. Latter's imagination, and her features contorted with hate. She rose abruptly from her chair and began to pace around the office, to force herself to think of something else. So she thought about the fact that for some time, perhaps for a year, changes had taken place around her. A certain number of day students and boarders had left, revenues had decreased, several highly paid teachers had had to be replaced by others who would work for less. At the same time, she was hearing catchwords about the independence of women more and more often, as if they were being directed at her. At first, the expression independence had been used only by Miss Howard. Then the professors and classroom teachers had taken it up, and today the older pupils and even their mothers were repeating it. "What is that independence of theirs going to mean?" thought Mrs. Latter. "Horsemanship and painting? After all, those things are old as the world. Struggle with life? But, my God, how many years have I struggled with life? Independence from men, then? Oh, if they knew what I have freed myself from! What they are talking about, I am doing, or have been doing for a long time. And in spite of that, I do not understand them, and they consider me a hindrance. What I do, thousands of women in every generation have done. Indeed, there were even those who went to war. So why is it that today those things are cried up as a recent invention, created, moreover, by Miss Howard, who talks a great deal but does nothing positive. She is a good teacher, nothing more." "Am I disturbing you?" said a sweet voice behind her. Mrs. Latter started. "Ah, Magda," she said. "I am glad that you have come." The young woman called Magda, whom the pupils addressed as Miss Magdalena, came into the office in a cheerful frame of mind. It could be seen in her merry eyes, her laughing face, and in her whole person, which gave the impression that her pupils had just been dancing with her and smothering her with kisses afterward. But, glancing at Mrs. Latter, Magda felt that exuberance was out of place here. It seemed to her that the head mistress was either worried or very angry. But at whom and why? Perhaps at her, because a moment before she had been dancing with the fourth-formers, she, a classroom teacher. "I want to give you some work, Magda. Will you assist me?" said Mrs. Latter, seating herself at her desk. "How can you ask such a question, madam?" answered Magda. Then she blushed at the thought that such an answer might seem insolent to Mrs. Latter. She sat on the edge of the sofa and, inclining her head, looked at the head-mistress out of the corner of her eye, hoping to divine what was troubling her. Was she angry or worried? It must be that she was angry, at Magda naturally, because there had been dancing on the floor above. Indeed, Magda had been told so many times that a classroom teacher ought to uphold the dignity of her position. But who knew if, on the other hand, Mrs. Latter were angry because she had kissed Zosia Piasecka, and might infect the whole school with some sickness or other, or perhaps because she had interceded for Stanowska. "You see this, Magda?" said Mrs. Latter abruptly, handing her a packet of letter paper and a set of notes. "You must write this many letters, that is, if you like." "Only this many? I would only be truly happy if you asked me to write all the letters," Magda exclaimed in the tone of a soldier who wishes to devote his life to his commander. "Oh, you incurable enthusiast! But perhaps you will be cured some day, even faster than I think," said Mrs. Latter, lowering her voice. Then she added, "I am using your services for this tiresome work because I believe it may be to your advantage. Do you still plan to establish a school?" Madam, even with 2 grades, even with only 1, that is my highest dream," cried Magda, clasping her hands. Mrs. Latter smiled. "I hope your highest dream changes," she said. "I remember several of these dreams. In 6th form you dreamed of the convent. In 5th form you thought of dying, and felt that you simply must be buried in a pale blue coffin. And in 3rd form, if my memory does not fail, you wanted desperately to be a boy." "Ah, madam," sighed Magda, blushing to the top of her forehead and covering her face with her hands. "What is the matter with me? Oh, I will never make anything of myself." "Indeed you will. Only first you will relinquish a number of plans and, above all, the school." "Please, ma'am, it will only be a beginner's class." "Better and better," Mrs. Latter beamed. "But before you establish that beginner's class, write to the parents, aunts, and uncles of our young ladies. Write in this format. At the head, "Respected Sir," or "Respected Madam," and below, "Attaching at your request an invoice for the first half-term, I have the honor to remind you that this sum in rubles is payable to your account," and write the number shown on this sheet. "They owe that much?" Magda exclaimed fearfully, inspecting the notes. "They owe twice that much," replied Mrs. Latter, "but some will pay only after New Year's. Then there will be the sort who never pay." She wrenched herself out of her chair and began to walk around the study with her arms crossed on her chest. "Here you have the school you dream of," she said, trying to speak calmly. "Here are the fine revenues with which Miss Howard wants to set up classes in bookkeeping, crafts, gymnastics." "Lunatic!" hissed Mrs. Latter. "And I thought she was so wise," the girl remarked in a tone of wonder. "Ah, how beautifully she speaks! How forcefully she explains that today's woman is a burden to society and a slave to her family, that women ought to work on an equal footing with men, that they ought to have the same rights, and that their whole upbringing ought to be changed." Trembling with anger, Mrs. Latter stopped in front of Magda and began to speak in a choked voice. "At least hear that obsessed woman's prattle for what it's worth. You see how many thousands of rubles they owe me, and you can guess how many thousands I need between now and New Year's to feed the children and pay the teachers. So if today I'm racking my brain— Oh, how I do run on," she murmured, chafing her forehead. "So calculate it yourself. Where, under these conditions, can the money be found for lectures on new subjects? And how can the children find time for those studies? My head aches." She walked back and forth several times, then, taking the intimidated teacher by the hand, said more calmly, "I am a little ill and irritable, and I trust you, my child, so I babble. I know, however, that—" "Madam, you can suppose that I would repeat anything?" asked Magda. And then, gazing at Mrs. Latter with eyes full of tears and kissing her hand, she added, "Please, ma'am, I will give up my wages." The headmistress pressed her lips to the girl's feverish head. "Child, my dear child, what difference can your poor wage make to me? Your 15 rubles a month? Do not think of such a thing." Magda's eyes flashed as a great thought came to her. Her tears dried. "Very well, then. Please, ma'am, I will take my wages, but you will do me one great favor." And suddenly she knelt before Mrs. Latter, who raised her, laughing. "What favor is this?" "Since my grandmother's death," whispered Magda, lowering her eyes, "I have 3,000 rubles. So you will be so good, so dear—" "And take this money from you, you mean? Oh, you incorrigible! Remember, for how many purposes can this money be appropriated? You are going to establish a school." "I am not going to establish—" "Excellent. You have decided quickly. You are going to lend Miss Howard 1,000 rubles. You wanted to pay your own way until your education is finished." "You are laughing at me!" Magda burst into sobs. "No, I'm only doing calculations, because, after all, you are still going to go abroad and take Helena at your own expense." "Oh, madam," sobbed Magda. "It's a good thing you do not have the money in hand, and that you do not have control of it. If I were as wealthy as Ada— Ha!" Mrs. Latter said as if to herself. Magda's face regained its animation, and her eyes flashed with joy. "Well, but enough of this, my child. Go upstairs through my bedroom, wash your face, and set about writing the letters. Only don't stir up a commotion, you scatterbrain," Mrs. Latter said, by way of concluding their conversation. The shamefaced girl took the paper and went out to Mrs. Latter's bedroom, finishing her cry on the way. She was terribly sad because she had learned so suddenly about the headmistress's financial troubles, and because she suspected herself of committing 1,000 blunders. "How I babble! What nonsense I talk! No, in all the world there is no more stupid creature than I," she thought, sobbing. Mrs. Latter looked after her. In spite of herself, she saw 2 sets of features in her imagination, one beside the other. Magda's mobile face, on which a different feeling flamed every minute, and the countenance of her daughter Helena, with its statuesque beauty. One was alive with sympathy for everything and everyone, the other was perpetually serene. A very good child, but Helena has more dignity. She does not let herself be carried away, Mrs. Latter thought proudly. Meanwhile, Magda, before she settled down to write the letters, prayed that God would allow her to help Mrs. Latter, even at the sacrifice of her own life. Then she recalled many other people who also had their troubles, the sick, Zosia, a watchman who had been robbed, a certain pupil in the 5th form who loved Kazimierz Norski without hope, and again she felt a need to sacrifice herself for these unhappy ones. And because the thought came to her that the Lord God would not want to do anything in answer to the prayer of such a paltry being as herself, she sat down to write her letters, full of doubt and despair, humming in an undertone, "Do you know the country where the lemon ripens?" It seemed to her that precisely that melody best expressed her feeling of being fit for nothing, together with the impossibility of sacrificing herself for the world in general, and, in particular, for Mrs. Latter, the sick Zosia, the watchman who had fallen among thieves, and the unlucky 5th form student with her unrequited love. Chapter 3. The Dawn of Awareness. For several days, Magdalena was not herself. Her eyes lost their sparkle and became hollow. Her olive face grew pale, and her black hair almost lost its curl, all of which gave her a look of mourning. She slept uneasily and ate poorly. If she laughed, it was only by mistake. If she sang, it was because she forgot herself. And if she did a dance step or two with one of her pupils, it was completely mechanical. Her heart was not in any of these manifestations of cheer. Miss Magdalena knew that her spirits were devoid of merriment, and she would not have been angry if all the world had known about this curious climate of the soul that had left her full of care, serious and secretive. This awful state of mind weighed so heavily upon her that, in spite of herself, she began to seek out companionship and conversation. It was because of that the young teacher, not knowing exactly when, found herself on the threshold of the 5th form classroom. Not knowing exactly why, she summoned from the room the pretty little pupil who was unfortunately infatuated with Kazimierz, and at that moment was working on her German exercises. A few girls in brown dresses ran up to Magdalena, kissed her face, hair, and neck, fondled her solicitously, and lamented that the soup at dinner had not been good, and that the rain was keeping them from their walk. Magdalena spoke to them soothingly, but in a broken voice, so the girls withdrew far back into the room, and then, linking arms, went into a corner, whispered, and pointed to her with such unmistakable signs of sympathy that Magdalena felt like crying. At one moment she had a desire to disclose her great secret to the whole class, but in the next she remembered that that secret was not her secret, and she became still sadder, still more tightly locked into herself. Meanwhile, the 5th form student on whose support Magdalena had counted most was approaching her, but she looked as though the teacher's secret did not concern her in the least, because she had a care of her own for which none of the classroom teachers could have found a remedy. In spite of that, Magdalena led her to the visitors' parlor, sat beside her on the sofa, and said with a sigh, "How fortunate you are, my Zosia!" The 5th form student forgot about her German exercises and burst into tears. "So you know all about it, miss?" she asked, snuggling up to Magdalena's shoulder. "You are fortunate," Magdalena repeated, "because you are still too young to understand what strange states of the soul there are." The 17-year-old pupil regarded the 18-year-old teacher with astonishment and answered, frowning, "You speak as he spoke when we met for the first time in the corridor in this very, I thought I would burn into a cinder with shame, and he murmured, 'What a pretty poppet! Have you ever heard the like?' I thought I would tear him apart, yet At that moment, I felt that I would never stop loving him." Her speech broke off in quiet sobs. "I tell you, Zosia, there are worse anxieties than love." "Oh, God, I know, but they always proceed from love." "You are a little simpleton, my Zosia," Magdalena interrupted her with a dignified air. "As long as a woman loves, she is happy, even though I should not talk of such things with you. Unhappiness sets in only when a woman begins to think of serious matters, as a man does. When, for example, she thinks of money, of the welfare of others other than herself, of rescuing someone from grave difficulties." "Oh, if you mean me," Zosia burst out with burning eyes, "no one will rescue me. From the moment when Jadzia Zeidler saw how he kissed Miss Joanna, my life was in ruins. So it was not on my account that he stopped by the classroom. Not for me he was searching when he looked at our window from the courtyard. So that is why he did not pick up the rose I threw out to him. But I will not trouble them. I am dying, let it be understood, not because of that little flirt, only for him. Let him be happy with whom he likes, although I have a premonition that some day he will regret me." Having said that, Zosia burst into tears, and Magdalena looked at her, astonished. "My Zosia, what nonsense are you talking? Who kissed Joanna?" "And who would it be if not Kazimierz? She led him on, that predatory creature, because of her jealousy." Magdalena rose ceremoniously from the sofa and said, "Miss Joanna is a classroom teacher and a proper person who would never allow Kazimierz to kiss her." "Are you sure?" asked Zosia, clasping her hands. "I am absolutely certain, and now I regret that I chose you for a confidant." "Oh, Miss Magdalena!" Zosia entreated her, crying and laughing. "You are a child," Magdalena interrupted her sternly. "So you do not understand that there can be more serious things in a woman's life than such flights of the heart. You will be convinced of that when you begin to think of the interests of others and find yourself faced with the necessity of saving someone." "I am saved. I will not die, Miss Magdalena. Now I understand everything. Jadzia must be in love with him herself, so she lets fall this slander in order to discourage me. Oh, I guessed as much." She kissed Magdalena again and again, wiped her eyes, and fled from the visitors' parlor. "What a silly little thing she is," thought Magdalena. "If Mrs. Latter had told her what she told me, and if she had to think of a way to help, love would vanish from her thoughts directly. Speaking of that, Ada must lend the head-mistress money, but in the meantime, what is coming over me?" Magdalena felt sadder and sadder, more and more heavily burdened. For her it was not simply a question of sharing the great secret with someone, but of learning whether the awakening of mature awareness in every person were not connected with such anxiety. After all, in her beginner's class, and even at home, it had been necessary for her to exercise thought. For 7 years her thinking had been guided by the program of the school, since she was a boarding student. Now it was a year since she had emerged from that curriculum and become a classroom teacher, and yet no frame of mind had ever seemed so unaccustomed and singular. She felt that after her talk with Mrs. Latter, a spring had gushed forth in her soul, the spring of psychic processes, which, until now, she had never guessed existed, even though from her first year at school she had always been called a reflective child. "Surely that independence Miss Howard speaks of must have awakened in me," Magdalena thought. "No, I should not avoid contact with that woman, for only she can explain my state of mind to me." Under the influence of this idea, she made her way to Miss Howard's door, but, hearing that a conversation was going on in the room, she knocked gently. There were 3 people in the room. Most prominent was Miss Howard, who was sitting in an armchair with her arms folded across her chest, speaking at length. Opposite her, a carelessly dressed university student with very untidy hair fidgeted on a wicker chair, a threadbare cap in his hand. On a stool, leaning on the arm of Miss Howard's chair, as if she were hiding behind the teacher, sat Mania Levinska, a lovely sixth former, from whose childlike face shone, remarkably, the eyes of a mature woman. Magdalena saw that Mania looked at the student with an expression of serene delight, that Miss Clara was devouring him with her eyes, and that he gazed at Miss Howard but thought of Mania, hidden behind the armchair. "Come in," called Miss Howard, extending her hand. "Mr. Władysław Kotowski, Miss Magdalena Brzeska." Those introduced bowed to each other, and the unkempt student assumed an expression of dissatisfaction with the newcomer. However, when Magdalena seated herself in such a way that she did not obstruct his view of Mania, and could not intercept his glances at the girl, he was at ease. "Pity you did not arrive a quarter of an hour ago," said Miss Howard. "I was just reading my article, which Mr. Kotowski is taking to the review. I am developing the idea that the state should give illegitimate children names, educations, and financial endowments, and the better names and the higher the education, the more illegitimate children will be respected, and the result of that will be that the problem will be solved, because as long as women must depend on men, even in such natural matters—" Magdalena thought she would fall through the floor, but Mania, as if not hearing, looked with glowing eyes at the student, who shifted in his chair, blushed, and crumpled his hat. "Do you think," demanded Miss Howard, addressing the student, "that there is some absurdity in what I say?" "Please, ma'am, I think nothing," replied the student, who was nearly terrified. "But you do think so. Oh, I read it in your soul, as if in an open book, even those secrets which you desire to hide from yourself." On hearing that, Mania was covered with blushes, and Władysław, no less embarrassed, made a move as if to hide his head under his chair. "You forget, however," continued Miss Howard, "that I do not speak of men in general, only of that one whom today's society forces on a woman, and who calls himself husband." Miss Howard continued in this vein for several minutes, speaking in a beautiful contralto, but Magdalena would not have been able to repeat a word. It only seemed to her that the rosy-faced and flaxen-haired apostle of the independence of women had said, in front of the student, things so indecent that one must think of something else so as to avoid hearing them. And because her own thoughts were in a muddle, she began reciting inwardly, "Our Father," and "Hail Mary." Indeed, both those prayers so absorbed her attention that as she looked at Miss Howard, she heard her mellifluous voice, but understood nothing. But the student must have understood, for he extended and retracted his legs, raised his eyebrows, ran first his right hand and then his left through his bushy hair, and in general behaved like a criminal on the rack. The thought came to Magdalena that the young man would not feel such torment if, like her, he would at least recite the Ave Maria. But because he was no doubt an atheist like all university students, and did not believe in the efficacy of prayer, the poor wretch could not escape hearing Miss Clara's appalling lecture. At last Miss Howard, finishing her speech, went to her desk and began to unfasten, unfurl, and then do up again and tie a roll of paper on which was written her interesting article about those children. During that time, Mania drew near the student and began to speak softly. "Goodbye," said the girl. And will you come on Tuesday? Do you doubt it? And bring back Krasinski? With annotations. You will overwork yourself. Goodbye. Goodbye. The student barely touched her hand, but how they looked at each other, with such affection, but so sadly, as if they were saying goodbye forever, although they were parting only until Tuesday. Magdalena wanted to kiss them both, to laugh with them, to cry, in a word, to do everything they would demand of her, because they seemed so beautiful and so unhappy that they would not see each other for a few days. At that moment, Miss Howard gave the roll of paper to the student, who took his leave of her indifferently enough and ran out quickly, no doubt thinking he would be able to get one more look at Manya, who had gone out before him. Miss Howard was beaming. She threw herself on the armchair again, and, looking at the ceiling as if her dreams were spinning themselves out there, said to Magdalena, "Have you come for a little tete-a-tete? Such an interesting young man, don't you think? I like to observe as a sublime idea, or feeling springs forth and develops in an unsullied soul." "Oh, yes," Magdalena affirmed, thinking of the student and Manya. "You perceived it as well?" "Naturally, indeed, it is obvious." Miss Howard assumed an expression of modesty distressed. "I can hardly fathom," she said in a subdued voice, "what it is about me that appeals to him." Magdalena quivered with astonishment. "Surely, common aspirations, views," continued Miss Howard, falling farther into a dreamy languor. "Yes, it is some kinship of the soul. But let us not speak of that, dear Miss Magdalena. Let us rather speak of you. What an enthusiast! How he listens to my articles! Only since I have had such an audience have I understood that it is possible to listen beautifully. But enough about that. Miss Magdalena, let us talk about you. Perhaps you have some worry? An unconventional young man! So, something has brought you to me? Surely also the little soul awakes. Is it true that I divined it? Oh, we women are remarkable beings. We hold the animal herd of men in contempt, yet if an exceptional man is found... But you have something on your heart, Miss Magdalena. We will speak of what you want to tell me." Magdalena was as confused, hearing Miss Howard's poetic babble, as if she had found herself in an unfamiliar neighborhood. So she, that stiff, angry, sometimes rancorous Miss Howard, of whom Mrs. Ladder stood in awe, she, who had spoken of indecent things in the presence of young students, was speaking of the kinship of souls and of cares of the heart? Magdalena could not restrain herself. The outburst that had been several days in the making would wait no longer. She fell on her knees before Miss Howard, threw her arms around her neck, and, kissing her several times, said in a tremulous voice, "Ah, madam, how good you are! I thought that you were only very wise and had no heart. But how I misled myself!" she added, springing up off her knees and sitting on the stool beside the chair. "Enthusiast! You enthusiast!" said Miss Howard indulgently. "And who is the man to whom you have entrusted your heart?" "You think that I am in love? No!" A shadow of dissatisfaction appeared on Miss Howard's pink face. "I only want to talk with you," said Magdalena, "because you are so understanding, so energetic, and I need courage very much." "And so you have some serious purpose?" asked Miss Howard in a masterful tone, as if she were the self-appointed instructor of everyone with a serious purpose. "Oh, very serious," Magdalena said fervently. "Only it is a secret that I must carry with me to the grave. Anyway," she added, sighing profoundly, "Madam is so understanding, and am convinced today, also noble, dear, and good." "That is still uncertain, little minx," Miss Howard interjected with a smile. "Oh, very dear. I, at least, adore you, so I will disclose this great secret to you. I must," Magdalena whispered. "Even if I die for it, I must try to get money for—" "For whom?" asked Miss Howard, amazed. "For Mrs. Latter," Magdalena whispered still more quietly. Miss Howard threw up her arms. "She asked you for it?" "God forbid! She does not even guess." "So she needs money, that great lady," said Miss Howard. Someone knocked at the door. "Come in." A servant entered and informed Magdalena that Ada was asking for her. "I will come directly," answered Magdalena. Obviously God prompted her to summon me at this moment. But dearest Miss Clara, not a word about this to anyone. I would die, I would kill myself if anyone found out. And she ran from the room, leaving her listener plunged in an ocean of astonishment. So, Latter has no money, and I had hoped to hold serious discussions with her about the reform of education, thought Miss Howard. Chapter 4. The Homely Girl. Magdalena went in for a while to the bedroom that served as her living quarters. On the way she hugged some pupils, greeted a few classroom teachers, who smiled at the sight of her, and said "Good evening" to a chambermaid in a white apron. But in the meantime she pondered. Miss Howard, there is a woman, and I've only today come to appreciate her. Who would have supposed that she was such a good, tender-hearted creature? But Bolesław is a cad. There's nothing strange in his loving Miss Howard, although I would prefer Mania. But why is he leading Mania on? Ah, these men! It seems that Miss Howard is completely justified in her contempt for them. From the corridor, tall doors on the right and left led to the bedrooms. Magdalena opened one door and entered a large blue room with 3 beds standing in front of one wall and another 3 in front of another wall. The foot of each bed was toward the center of the room. 6 iron bedsteads covered with white spreads. On each one pillow, next to each a little cabinet at the head and a wooden chair at the foot. The floor was coated with oil-based paint, and on the wall, over each bed, hung either the Lord Jesus on the cross or the Divine Mother, or sometimes both together, the Divine Mother above, the Lord Jesus below. Only above the head of Judith Rosenzweig, who was Jewish, hung a commonplace Saint Joseph with a lily in his hand. One corner of the room, separated from the rest by a screen of sapphire blue, was Magdalena's own chamber. In this tiny area of the bedroom, everything seemed calculated to help the boarding students to a proper appreciation of the gulf that divided them from the classroom teacher. The screen itself undoubtedly aroused their wonder and respect, and those feelings certainly intensified at the sight of the blue spread and the 2 pillows on the bed, not to mention the wicker chair and the little table on which sat a brown candlestick with a glass wax saver and a piece of tallow candle. Unfortunately, Magdalena, whose older friends considered her a little whimsical, undermined the glamour of her position of her own accord. She allowed students to avail themselves of the candlestick with the wax saver and to run behind the screen. She did not even forbid them to lie on her bed during the course of the day. But because everyone loved Magdalena, the other classroom teachers wrote these evidences of indiscretion up to her inexperience, notwithstanding that Mrs. Latter looked at her from time to time in a way that certainly meant that she knew about the candlestick with the wax saver and about the students' naps behind Magdalena's screen. After combing her hair, which had become somewhat tousled when she embraced Miss Howard, Magdalena took a book from the table and finally set off to meet Ada, who was waiting for her. She went slowly through the corridors and down the stairs. At moments she stopped, and, nodding her head or putting a finger to her lips, thought, "First I will tell her how much Mrs. Ladder pays for the premises and the upkeep of the school, and how much she pays the teachers. No, first I will say that there are parents who delay payment until the vacation, and also do not pay after the vacation. Oh, no, I will tell her straight out. My Ada, if I had your fortune, I would lend Mrs. Ladder 50,000 rubles right away. No, that is all wrong. Oh, what is wrong with me? I think for so many days, and I cannot devise anything sensible." Ada Solska was a very wealthy orphan. To be sure, she loved her brother Stefan more than life. To be sure, she had immediate and distant family, who loved her more than life. But to be sure, a year and a half ago she had finished school and could have gone into a world which, so as it was said, awaited her with longing. But, in spite of all that, Ada lived at Mrs. Ladder's school. She paid 1,000 rubles a year for accommodations, services, and board, and stayed in Mrs. Ladder's home because, in reality, as she herself maintained, she had nowhere to live. She did not like the family that loved her more than life. Her adored Stefan, a man of 30, had a passion for continually visiting foreign universities, although he had assured her that, once she finished school, they two would not be separated, that either he would settle down with her on one of the parental estates, or she would travel about Europe with him, seeking out universities hitherto undiscovered by anyone. But whenever Ada was bold enough to doubt that these plans would bear fruit, her brother would answer shortly, "My Ada, we must, even if we did not want to, look after each other to the end of life. You are so rich that everyone wants to swindle you, and I am so ugly that nobody has taken me away from you." "But, Stefan," his sister would answer indignantly, "where did you come by the notion that you were ugly? It is I who am a fright, not you." "Ada, I tell you, you're talking drivel," her brother would say peevishly. "You are a very pleasing, completely agreeable young lady, only a little shy, and I? If I were less ugly, I would shoot myself in the head from self-loathing. But I must live with those graces which Heaven bestowed on me, and in that way I am useful to people. Because whoever looks at me says, 'How happy I am that I am not like that maggot.'" Ada occupied 2 rooms on the second floor. In one was a student's iron bed, covered by a white spread, with a nightstand beside it. Only a suite of furniture upholstered with grey jute served as evidence that a student did not reside there. The other room, which had 2 windows, was quite singular, for it looked like a laboratory. In it stood a large table covered with oilcloth, several free-standing shelves filled with books and atlases, a blackboard on easels with chalk and a sponge that were obviously in continuous use, and finally a great cabinet full of instruments for the study of physics and chemistry. There were precise weights, an expensive microscope, a concave mirror, a lens a couple of inches thick, an electroscope, nor was there a shortage of retorts, jars, and flasks with reagents. There was an astronomical globe, the skeleton of some bird, and the indispensable crocodile, fortunately very young and stuffed. All these objects awakened wonder in the younger pupils and vexation in the older ones, who did not always succeed in distinguishing between the microscope and the electroscope. All these objects were Miss Solska's personal property. Not only had she purchased them and kept them in good condition, she even knew how to use them. They were her ball gowns, as she said, smiling gently and sadly. An old teacher of her brother's had wakened in her the taste for the natural sciences. The predilection was supported by her brother, himself an ardent devotee of the exact sciences, and Ada's cleverness and disinclination for the life of the salon did the rest. Nothing attracted her to wider society. Indeed, her belief that she was ugly frightened her away from it. So she hid in her laboratory, read a great deal, and continually took lessons from the best professors. The wealthy members of her family considered Ada an egotist, and the very grand took her for a sick person. For neither they nor any of their friends, visitors or acquaintances could understand why a rich young woman of 19 preferred science to salons and did not think of marriage. People only began to comprehend the eccentricity of the wealthy heiress when the news spread through the salons that in Warsaw, in addition to democracy and positivism, a new epidemic had broken out called female emancipation. Two species of the emancipated had begun to be distinguishable, one of which smoked cigars, dressed in masculine attire, and went abroad to study medicine with men, while the other type, less audacious and perhaps more moral, limited itself to the purchase of very large books and shunned salons. Ada belonged to the second type, and because of that, resentment was rising in certain quarters against Mrs. Latter. However, because girls from that sphere of society studied in boarding schools only rarely, the wrath of the elite only came to this, that one of Ada's aunts, who visited her sometimes, began to greet Mrs. Latter more coolly than formerly. Mrs. Latter responded with yet greater coolness, rightly or wrongly seeing the source of the lady's aversion not so much in Ada's scientific pursuits as in her fortune. It seemed to her that if Ada had been a poor girl, neither her nearer nor more distant aunts would have been alarmed either at their niece's acquisition of big books or at the emancipation of women that had begun to sweep over Warsaw. Magdalena stopped once more at the door of Ada's apartment, and once more put a finger to her lips, like a pupil who is mentally reviewing her lesson. Finally she crossed herself and, pushing the door wide open, walked vigorously in. "How are you, Ada?" she called, doing her best to be cheerful. "What happened so suddenly? I was just about to come to you when Stanisław arrived. How are you, my precious? Are you ill?" And as she kissed Ada, she began to look attentively at her yellowish complexion, her slanted eyes, her very high forehead, very wide mouth, and very small nose. She glanced at her thin, dark blonde hair, and surveyed her slight figure in its black gown, seated on a leather armchair, but discovered no sign of sickness. She rather saw that Ada looked intently at her, and that confused her. "It is not with me, but with you, that something is the matter, Magda," Miss Solska remarked slowly in a mild tone. Magdalena flushed from head to toe. She wanted to throw herself on Ada's neck and whisper, "Darling, lend Mrs. Latter some money." But she was seized by a fear that she might ruin everything, and her voice died inside her. She dropped into a chair beside Ada and looked her in the eye with mock sternness, making an effort to smile. At last she said, "I am a little tired, but that will pass, Ada. It has passed already." Uneasiness came over Ada's sallow face. Her eyelids began to tremble, and her wide mouth pursed as if she were about to cry. "Perhaps, Magda," she remarked still more quietly, "perhaps you were offended with me because I sent Stanisław to you? After all, I know I should have gone myself, but it seemed to me that it would be quieter down here." Magdalena instantly recovered her vivacity. She leaned over in her chair and seized her friend in an embrace, laughing as ingenuously as she alone in all the school could laugh. "Ah, unkind Ada!" she cried. "How can you suspect me of anything like that? When have you seen me offended at anyone, least of all you? So good, so dear, such an angel." "Because, you see, I am afraid of offending. I already cause people so much pain by my person." Magdalena cut off a long train of confessions with kisses, and the young women's mutual fears were dispelled. "You see, I wanted to tell you this," Ada began, putting her small hands on the arm of her chair. "You know that Romanovich cannot give us lessons since he has left the school." "Naturally." "Mr. Dembitsky has taken his place." "The one who lectures on geography to the lower classes? How diverting he is!" "For your information, he is a great scholar, a physicist, and a mathematician. Above all, a mathematician. Stefan has known him for a long time and has often spoken to me of him." "And if that is the case," Magdalena interjected, "still he looks strange. I tell you, Miss Howard cannot look at him. She turns her head away." "Miss Howard!" Ada said with distaste. "How many persons she turns her head away from, though she herself is not beautiful. Anyway, Dembitsky is not ugly. What a mild face he has. And have you noticed his way of looking at people?" "It's true, he has fine eyes, large and blue." "Even Stefan told me that Dembitsky has an exquisite way of looking at one. Stefan described it very beautifully. This is what he said. When Dembitsky looks at a person, one feels that he sees everything and forgives everything." "True, what a wonderful description!" cried Magdalena. "And it is possible that such a gentleman lectures on geography in the lower grades?" A shadow of sadness fell on Ada's face. "Stefan also predicted," she said, "that he will not have a fine career because he is too modest, and very modest people—" She waved a hand dismissively. "You are right. He seems odd precisely because he is shy. In the second form he was so confused that the girls began to giggle. Imagine! He was here an hour ago with Mrs. Ladder and me, and also appeared trouble. But when Mrs. Ladder left and we started to talk about Stefan, and when after that he began to pose questions to me, I must say he was another man. A different look, different movements, a different voice. He was, I tell you, impressive," said Ada. "Perhaps it will be an embarrassment to him to lecture to the three of us?" Magdalena asked suddenly. "It will be nothing of the kind. You will even be amazed when I tell you that he not only mentioned you and Hella, but gave us his appraisal of each of you." "Appraisal of me?" "Yes. He said that you must be very intelligent, only you forget easily." "Is it possible?" "On my word of honor. And about Hella, he said that she does not care much for mathematics.